Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers heat balance in marine mammals. So heat balance is essentially the ability to maintain and generate heat within a body. Marine mammals have a more difficult time of this than terrestrial mammals. So as part of this lecture, we'll look at what are the sources of heat? In other words, how do marine mammals generate heat? What are some of the strategies they employ to conserve it? And finally, we'll look at one that's a little bit more complicated called the countercurrent heat exchange system. To begin, let's refresh with the idea that marine mammals and mammals in general are considered to be warm-blooded. So what warm-blooded actually means is that you have the ability to maintain a consistent and usually elevated body temperature regardless of the temperature in the environment. So from a human perspective, your temperature is 98.6 degrees, regardless of whether or not it's 50 degrees out, 70 degrees out, or 100 degrees out. This is what it means to be warm-blooded. Now, for terrestrial mammals, which would include humans, we constantly deal with heat loss, but this is exaggerated in marine mammals, and that's because water draws heat away at 25 times the rate as air. So this is one reason why humans, for example, die quickly of hypothermia if they are immersed in water for too long, even if the water feels tropical or warm. Of course, it's again accentuated if the water is cold. So that means that all marine mammals then face a more challenging environment than terrestrial mammals do in terms of heat balance. They're going to have more difficulty thermoregulating, and what thermoregulating means is regulating the thermal temperature of their body than other mammals that live on land. And again, this is a direct consequence of the fact that water is going to draw away that heat 25 times more efficiently than air would. So let's start by looking at where can we get heat from? In other words, where are sources of heat? And the number one source is metabolism. So metabolism is actually the major source of heat in all mammals, and metabolism is a collection of chemical reactions that occur within the body. And every time that you have a chemical reaction, some of that energy is released as heat. Now, interestingly, you can capture heat this way just from generic chemical reactions that your body runs for a purpose, such as the chemical reactions associated with digestion. And in some cases, you'll actually run chemical reactions for the sole purpose of generating heat. In other words, what chemical reaction you're running doesn't really matter as long as it generates a lot of heat. With humans, we see this with small infants that are born with a layer of what's called brown fat. That brown fat is actually just burned through for the sole purpose of giving that infant more body heat because their body design does not facilitate conserving heat. You know, they're small, they have a lot of appendages, they lose heat quickly. So obviously there's two ways to generate heat. You can either just burn through fuel for no other purpose than generating heat, or you can use some of the byproduct of heat released from chemical reactions that your body would use otherwise, such as aerobic respiration and digestion. There's another source of heat though as well, and that is muscle contractions. Every time you move or you generate a muscle contraction, that kinetic energy also releases some heat. And some of these, of course, will be done when you are moving actively. For a marine mammal, this usually means swimming. But you can also do things that generate muscle contractions without a lot of activity, and we see that with shivering, and some marine mammals also shiver for a similar reason, simply to get the kinetic energy that comes with the shivering or the shaking to generate heat. So those are really our two sources of heat. Metabolism is number one, and then muscle contractions are going to be a second additional source. So now that we've looked at generating heat, we know, of course, that marine mammals are going to have a difficult time conserving it. So they employ a variety of anatomical, physiological, and behavioral adaptation that all kind of help them thermoregulate in the challenging aqueous environment. And as we move forward and we talk about some of those adaptations, I'm going to be referencing terrestrial mammals compared to amphibious, compared to obligate marine mammals. So it's important to remember that a terrestrial mammal is like a human or a cat or a dog. They just live on land. An amphibious marine mammal would be most of our pinnipeds, so seals and sea lion, that spend some of their time on land and some of their time in the water. And then of course we have our obligate marine mammals, which spend all of their time in the water. So let's take a look at what they can do in order to conserve their heat. We're basically going to go through 4 major adaptations to help them conserve and generate their heat. The first one actually deals with adjusting the metabolic rate. Then we'll look at the anatomical insulation. We'll look at some of their behavioral responses. And finally, we'll take a look at the more complicated blood flow adaptations that some of them employ, including this counter-current heat exchange mechanism that I mentioned at the beginning. So let's look at the first one. If you simply want to generate more heat, increase your metabolic rate. It's that simple. By increasing your metabolic rate, you're going to generate more heat as a byproduct. So it implies that marine mammals, because they need to generate more heat, probably have an increased metabolic rate. And what that means is when we look at metabolic rate, we're really looking at number of chemical reactions run per gram of tissue. And whenever we look at how marine mammals are going to be assessed in terms of their metabolic rate, we always need to compare them against a terrestrial mammal of similar size. And the reason why similar size is important is because there's the old adage, it takes more energy to run a gram of mouse than a gram of moose. In other words, the larger you are as an organism, the less energy you actually have to expend to keep you warm. And so smaller organisms have to generate more heat per gram of tissue than a larger organism is. So when we take a look at marine mammals, we're always comparing them against terrestrial mammals of similar size. And as a general generic rule, most marine mammals do have an elevated metabolic rate. And dolphins and most pinnipeds and even some other smaller whales that they've assessed have shown that 1.5 to 2 times the metabolic rate that would be expected for a terrestrial mammal is standard. So that means a dolphin probably runs 1.5 to 2 times as many chemical reactions as a standard terrestrial mammal of the same size. But that's the generic answer, and the real answer, of course, is much more broad than that. So interestingly enough, not all marine mammals actually have that elevated metabolism. When we look at manatees and dugongs, for example, they actually have a lower metabolic rate than what would be expected for their size. And one of the reasons for this is they don't move around very much, and they stay in pretty warm water, which means they don't lose a lot of heat either. On the flip side of that, we have the exceptional sea otters, which generate much more metabolic, or a much higher metabolic rate than what would be expected, anywhere up to 3 times as much as a standard animal that would live on land. So again, water temperature has something to do with it, and some of the other adaptations that they might employ has something to do with the rate of metabolism. So probably one of the most important things to look at is how that animal is insulated. So what are some of the anatomical adaptations that you can use? Really, it's blubber, which we've already talked about in a previous lecture, is very insulating, and then fur, which is also employed by some animals as well. So when we take a look at what anatomical adaptations we have, it seems to be kind of more of a gradient. And so when we look at the gradient, on one end of the spectrum we have only blubber, and on the other end of the gradient we have only fur. And so then of course many marine mammals kind of fall in between that. So cetaceans, which do not have any hair except maybe for a few hair follicles, rely strictly on blubber. And then on the other end of the spectrum, sea otters, which have almost no blubber, rely almost strictly on fur. Otariids, like our sea lions, are going to be kind of half and half, and then our phocids, which are true seals, rely more on blubber, and they have a thicker blubber layer and less on fur. So somewhere in there, insulation is achieved by these various mechanisms. Now, it's interestingly, when we think about some of these ideas, Of course, blubber is probably the best insulating mechanism, but it's not necessarily one that a marine mammal uses. So let's actually talk about fur for a moment with the sea otters. Sea otters have the densest fur known anywhere in the mammalian lineage, which means that they have more hair follicles per square inch than any other mammal, period. And that's because they rely only on the fur, and their fur is so necessary to their insulating ability that they spend up to 12% of their time actually grooming that fur. And if anything happens to compromise the fur, like let's say an oil slick, then they actually risk freezing to death because the insulating power of their fur is compromised. Okay, also marine mammals will show some behavioral adaptations that will help them conserve heat, particularly in the water. We see this more when we're looking at ones that are covered in fur, such as the otariids and the sea otters. And one of the things they'll do is they'll take whatever is poorly insulated, which is usually an appendage. So flippers, for example, hands, feet, they come out of the water as an example to help conserve that heat. And we see this strikingly with the sea otters, and we also see this strikingly with a California sea lion. And we're going to take a quick look at how the California sea lions do this now. So one of the things that we just saw was actually a California sea lion. The California sea lion was exhibiting the jug handling positioning, or what's called jugging for short, where they actually stick their fore flipper and their hind flipper out as a thermoregulatory mechanism. And of course, as we've discussed, this is one of the cool ways that they can actually stay warm when they are sitting out and floating in the open water. We know that water dissipates heat 25 times more efficiently than air does. And so in the water, they are in constant danger of hypothermia, especially when they're not moving and generating their own body heat from activity. So by sticking their fins or flippers out, they can actually keep some of their core body temperature by exposing it to air as opposed to keeping it in water. And now that you guys have seen jugging, which is how California sea lions conserve their heat, or one of the ways they conserve their heat, let's turn to the countercurrent heat exchange mechanism. So when you're looking at the countercurrent heat exchange mechanism, the idea is that you send blood that is going to be cooled off, and you're going to run it back down by blood that is going to be warm. And so the idea is simply this. All marine mammals have different areas that are going to be differently insulated. So areas that tend to be poorly insulated, again, are going to be the appendages, which are going to be your fins, and then your flukes and your dorsal fin for cetacean. When you send blood up there, it gets cooled off a lot faster. And if you were to just basically take that blood and run it up to a fluke, for example, and cool it off, and then run it down the other way, you would be sending cold blood back into the body. The body would have to work a lot harder to warm that blood up. So what they do instead is they take that blood and they send it up, and it cools off. But then what they do is they wrap it back around where it came from, so that you have the proximity between the arteries and the veins together like this. And in doing so, you actually end up with a transfer of heat, so that the venous blood that's coming back to the body is warmer than if you had just sent it away the other way. And that's called the countercurrent heat exchange mechanism. So again, the countercurrent heat exchange mechanism, we're looking at basically taking warm blood up, it cools off in the appendage, but then we funnel it back down to make sure that it gets a little bit warm before it goes back to the body. And then finally, do marine mammals ever get too hot? And the answer is absolutely yes. And they show many behavioral traits to actually accommodate this, such as flicking themselves with sand in the air, and then also going back into the water to cool off when they've been out on land. And with that, I'll see you next time.